morning, everyone. My name is Cassie Hopkins, and I coordinate the webinars for Hausmann Insurance. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Launching into Leadership, the 4 Traits of an Inspired Leader by Suzanne Templin. Today's webinar will run the full hour. If there is time after the webinar, we will have a question and answer session. If you have a question during the webinar, feel free to type it into the question or chat feature and Suzanne will address it. After the webinar is over, there will be a short survey we are hoping you can fill out for us to give us feedback on the webinar. Also, please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for review on the webinar archives of our website. You will receive a follow-up email from GoToWebinar with a link to the recording and the presentation slides. This webinar is certified for HRCI and SHRM Continuing Education credits, which will be available at the end of the webinar. I would now like to introduce you to our presenter for today's webinar, Suzanne Templin. Suzanne joined Hausmann Insurance in 2013 as an administrative associate and was promoted to office manager after a year. As the office manager, she does a little bit of everything around the office, but her true passion is leadership. From enhancing her own skills to teaching others, she finds the journey to becoming an excellent leader immensely gratifying. Suzanne is inspired to come to work each day because she truly believes in the services HGI provides. She feels a strong sense of ownership in and commitment to HGI's success because that success comes from protecting and supporting HGI's clients and the community. We are happy and thankful that Suzanne can be with us today to share her knowledge on this dynamic and engaging topic. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you, Cassie. Good morning, everyone, and happy Thursday. I want to thank you all so much for taking the time out of what I know are very busy schedules to join me for the next hour. I am honored to speak to you today and hope that you are able to glean some helpful tips and tricks to add to your arsenal of leadership skills. I do always like to start with an agenda, so you know what to expect from me as a presenter. I assume that you're all capable of reading, so I'll just gloss over it real briefly. I'll start out by spending a few minutes giving you a little bit of background about myself and why I feel that this topic is such an important one. We'll spend the majority of time looking at each of the 4 characteristics. I'll give you some examples and stories to help give you some context, and if we have time at the end, as Cassie mentioned, I will answer any questions you may have. If we don't have enough time for questions, don't worry. You can feel free to reach out to me directly. We'll pull up my contact info at the end of the presentation, or you can type your question into the survey that will pop up at the end of the presentation. Either way, rest assured, we will capture your questions and I will reach out to you right away. So in Cassie's introduction at the start of this webinar, she did a lovely job of summarizing my bio, but that doesn't really explain why I would be speaking to you about leadership today. My path to a position of leadership was one that I suspect may sound familiar to many of you in the audience today. I started out as a lowly employee, an administrative assistant, when my supervisor resigned, and I raised my hand as being interested in taking over her position. I was then promoted to my current position, office manager, with a small administrative team to coach and manage. A promotion that at the time came with no leadership training of any kind, formal or informal. I chuckle because when I think back on this, I remember saying to our VP of Human Resources, I believe that I'm ready. And like so many big decisions we make in life, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. But I've been learning from my mistakes and missteps through a lot of my own research and by having excellent leaders as mentors. I once heard author Malcolm Gladwell start a presentation by saying, people speak about things that they're experts in or things that they're passionate about. I can assuredly say that I fall into the latter group. I'm speaking to you about leadership because it's my passion, and passion is the gateway to expertise. Gladwell says that it takes about 10,000 hours to become an expert in any one subject, so I have a long way to go until I'm considered an expert. And now that I've admitted that I'm not an expert, I should also tell you that many of the topics we're going to discuss over the next hour are ones that I'm still working on every day. But my hope is that through this webinar, you'll see that that's sort of the point. These are all areas that require constant vigilance and practice, refreshers and reminders. I also want to mention that I personally learn by listening to other stories, experiences, and advice. So that's how I approach teaching. My intention in this webinar is not to wag my finger at anyone and say, you have to do this and you have to do that because I am the expert and I said so. Rather, my intention here is to open a dialogue by telling my stories and giving a few suggestions that have worked for us so that we can all learn from each other's experiences in an effort to become more effective leaders in our organizations. Because I honestly believe that doing so will make us and the companies we work for better stewards of our communities. So why is leadership such a big deal? I mean, if people just did their jobs, we wouldn't even need a boss, right? Well, I guess you could say that that's partially right in that a leader isn't necessarily a boss and a boss isn't necessarily a leader. Reflect on your own organization for a moment. Do you have anyone in your company who the other employees sort of look to as a weather vane? That is to say, the execs and mid-level managers can look to them to see kind of which way the wind is blowing because these people are naturally charismatic. People are drawn to them and want to follow them. But they don't necessarily supervise anyone. Those are your natural leaders. And on the flip side of that, maybe do you have a supervisor or boss in your organization or maybe in a past job who throws their weight around, gives commands, undermines the mission of the executives or the company at large? These folks may be supervising employees, but they are not leaders. Let me give you an example from when I worked for a large clothing corporation while I was living out west. I had just completed my master's program in Chicago and moved out to Oregon to live with my then boyfriend, now husband. And as I mentioned, I took this job with a large corporation and was hourly, working the standard 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And I was one of two people who answered the phones for their corporate office. As is the case in many offices, my supervisor was salaried and her responsibility was to manage the administrative team. Let me share with you what a typical day looked like for her, and I swear I'm not exaggerating any of this. She would come in around 9 a.m., a good hour after the office opened. She always had a Starbucks in her hand. We had a gym facility in our office, and from my desk at reception, I could see her working out for at least 2 hours every day. She would then take 2 to 3 additional hour-long trips to Starbucks every day. When she was in the office, I observed her engaging in immature gossip and flirting with many of the men in the office. As an employee observing this behavior, I would imagine that your reaction would have been similar to mine were you in my shoes. Needless to say, I did not respect my supervisor, and her behavior certainly didn't inspire me to be a better employee or to engage with the organization. It's vital to understand the nuance between being a boss and being a leader, because inspired leaders create inspired and engaged teams who feed directly into the success of the organization. And how many times have you heard people don't quit their jobs, they quit their bosses? Take another moment to reflect on your own experience. Have you ever left a job because your boss was a nightmare? Or, maybe it wasn't even that bad. Maybe you just felt like you had reached your potential at that job and there was no more room for growth. Would it have been different if your boss had worked with you throughout your career there to nurture your growth and find new ways to challenge and engage you. Or maybe you felt like your leader wasn't entirely honest or transparent with you, or they played favorites in your department. Human beings are observant creatures, and I think we sometimes think or hope that they won't notice when we're not at our best. But if you've ever noticed it in yourself or in others, you better believe that your employees have noticed it in you. Let me share with you another example from my own work experience. We're going to flash forward a few years from my previous example, and I'm now working in childcare. My supervisor was a wonderfully empathetic woman who believed in my potential. Awesome, right? We're moving in the right direction now. The problem was that she significantly favored certain teachers, and it was widely known and accepted throughout the center. In my case, I was working with one of the supervisor's favorites, a bully who used the silent treatment as a form of emotional manipulation. Every employee in that center knew this was the case. My supervisor knew this was the case. But rather than address the issue with the teacher who was the bully, who, by the way, had been working there for over 30 years, my boss wanted to find a teacher who could just deal with it. It should come as no surprise that in the 30 plus years that the bully worked there, no one was ever able to just deal with it for more than 2 years. And many, like me, ended up leaving the childcare field entirely. Again, that's not leadership. As empathetic and kind-hearted as my supervisor was, she still wasn't doing the hard work necessary to truly be an inspiring leader. Now, I mentioned on my previous slide that I believe that being better leaders will lead to company-wide improvements that will allow us to become better community members. That's not something that I just made up. That comes from Vince Molinaro's book, The Leadership Contract, in which he outlines the 5 core obligations of leadership. The first obligation is your obligation to your organization. The second is to your customers. The third obligation is to your employees. The fourth is to your community. And the fifth and final obligation is your obligation to yourself. These obligations are all intertwined. The notion that we have one work self and one home self is not only outdated, but it's also detrimental to the overall well-being of each of these facets of our lives. We are all influenced by where we work, who we work for, who we work with, and in what community. So that means that as leaders, we have to support and address all of these factors in order to truly be successful. The way we lead in the office impacts the health and effectiveness of our employees, and that affects the company's bottom line. Employees who feel supported and respected are more likely to go out and support and respect their partners, their children, their neighbors, and other members of their community. So that means that the work that we're doing as leaders has a profound impact on the world we live in. That's a lot of pressure, but it's also an incredible opportunity to shape our communities in such a meaningful and tangible way, just by being strong leaders. And you're in luck because none of this is rocket science. So you're all 100% capable of being awesome and inspiring leaders right here, right now. The first step is buying in and recognizing that you have room to improve. And since you're here listening to this webinar, hopefully most of you have already taken the first step. Now it's just about building up your toolbox and making use of the right tools at the right time. Most, if not all of the topics that we discussed today, you probably already have heard of or are already doing, and that's great. Some of you may have been in a position of leadership for decades. Others of you may be fairly new to the leadership arena, and that's all great too. That's one of the things I enjoy most about discussing leadership. It doesn't matter how long you've been doing it, or if you already know all the tricks of the trade. There's always value in sharing stories and getting the occasional refresher course to brush up on your skills. So let's dive in. Trust and respect are the basis of all healthy relationships, from your relationships to your coworkers, to the person who serves you your coffee, to your children, to your spouse. I have done a lot of reading and research on leadership, and there has been one common theme in literally every book, article, webinar, video, seminar, conference, and it's this: your employees have to trust you in order for them to respect you. So how do you earn their trust? You have to be honest with them, plain and simple. The most important relationship our employees have at work is with us, their supervisors. And dishonesty isn't always about telling outright lies. It often shows up more as like caginess, shadiness, or beating around the bush. Let me give you a hypothetical situation. Let's say your underperforming employee tells you that they want a pay increase, and here's your response. Well, I'm not sure. I'll have to talk to HR. We may not have enough in the budget this year, but, I'll definitely look into it for sure. Okay, in reality, you know that you are not going to give them a raise because they're underperforming. And instead of having the courage to tell them that you're not satisfied with their performance, you beat around the bush. You not only didn't give them a real answer, but you missed an opportunity to build trust with that employee by giving them honest feedback about their performance. We can model the honesty that we'd like to see in our employees by admitting openly when we make a mistake or when we don't know the answer. Then we can demonstrate how to fix the mistake or find the answer. That way, we show our employees that it's okay to make a mistake as long as you're honest about it, you fix it, and you learn from it. Doing so creates a safe space in the relationship between leader and employee, allowing you, the leader, to be able to give honest feedback that might sometimes be difficult for the employee to hear, but because your relationship is built on trust and respect, they'll be able to hear your feedback and are more likely to implement it. Simon Sinek, who is most famous probably for his TED Talks and his book Start With Why, has another book called Leaders Eat Last, in which he writes, in organizations in which there is no safety provided, people are more likely to hide mistakes or problems out of self-preservation. The issue is those mistakes and problems, if not addressed, often add up and appear later when they become too big to contain. It all really comes back to courage. And this is something that I have to admit I struggle with from time to time. I have found that if I think of being brave as a requirement of my job, it does help me a bit when I have to have a difficult conversation with a team member. But maybe that trick doesn't work for you, and it doesn't always work for me. So I have another suggestion that I've picked up from a seminar I attended through the Continuing Studies Division at the University of Wisconsin here in Madison. It's called Leading from the Center, and I actually did write a blog about this for our company website back in July. And if you're interested in reading any of my blog posts, you can find them at hausmann-johnson.com. Basically, all leading from the center means is taking a few calming breaths to give yourself time to remove your personal emotions from a situation in order to address it from a more logical, positive, and compassionate point of view. Let me share a personal example with you to give you some context. I had a coaching session with an employee from my team, one in which I had to share some difficult feedback about their behavior. I was really frustrated about it because I had addressed this exact issue with this employee previously, but they were still speaking unkindly to and about coworkers. Before the meeting, I took some time to think about what I really wanted from this individual. I wanted for them to change their negative behavior. and then I thought about how best to get that result. I went through a few scenarios in my head, including, this behavior is unacceptable and I won't stand for it. But obviously, that approach would have made my employee defensive. So I adjusted my wording to find the best way to address the issue. And here's what I went with. I know you are a kind and thoughtful person, and you would never intentionally hurt someone. So I'm thinking you might have spoken unkindly to your coworker without meaning to. Do you think you might be able to use a kinder tone of voice more consciously in the future? This coaching session that I was pretty nervous about ended up going really well. The employee admitted that this behavior was happening, and we brainstormed ways to make improvements in the future. It went well because I took the time to center myself, to remove my personal feelings of frustration from the situation before addressing the problem. I wanted to maintain our open, trusting relationship while still sharing this difficult feedback. And the best way I found to do this was to approach my employee with the foundation that they are a reasonable and rational person who had experienced a momentary lapse in their usual behavior. I think one of the reasons I'm so proud of this example is that centering isn't easy. It requires you to deflate your ego and allow yourself to become vulnerable in situations where the stakes feel high. But getting rid of that ego and negative emotions makes room for you to be a steadfast and rational leader. So speaking of vulnerability, let's move on to the next characteristic of an inspired leader, and it's one that you may not be totally comfortable with. Vulnerability can feel very scary for a lot of people, especially those in a position of power, because it seems counterintuitive. You know, in others, we see vulnerability as courageous and daring, but in ourselves, we see it as weakness, which causes fear. Ellen Ensher, author of the book Power of Mentoring, put it bluntly: face the fear. Embrace the discomfort of opening yourself up in order to build an open and honest relationship. One way that you can ease yourself into showing vulnerability is by sharing your stories with your employees. It can be as simple as sharing the difficulty you experienced when you were new to the company or to a particular field with an employee who is struggling to learn the ropes in their new position. I witnessed this done beautifully and organically several years ago in a conversation between a seasoned sales consultant and my husband, who had just embarked on his own sales consulting career. We were talking about making cold calls, and the seasoned veteran told my husband, "Oh yeah, when I first started out in sales, I would go into the bathroom at work, throw up, and then go out and make my cold calls." I could feel the relief course through my husband as this man, who is one of the highest performers in our agency, admitted to feeling exactly as nervous as my husband felt as a new salesman. This brief moment of self-disclosure developed rapport between them and engendered an even greater level of respect for this experienced sales consultant. Fast forward a few years, my husband and I still reflect on that moment every once in a while. It had such a profound impact on my husband, and he drew strength from this story. Now, it's important that your stories don't turn into one-upmanship. This isn't a competition to see whose story is sadder, whose life is more stressful. In fact, I would encourage you to make sure that you try to match the tone of your story to your employees as much as possible, so they don't feel like you're trying to prove anything to them. For instance, if your employee shares that they had to work late last week to finish a project, I would suggest not saying, "You think you have it bad. Well, I've been working late every day and on the weekends for the past 3 months. Rather, a simple statement, "Oh, that's no fun. I totally get it. I've been working late too." That's going to yield better results and build camaraderie. And I do want to note that you only have to share as much as you're comfortable sharing. If you're an extremely private person, just tell your employees that. That way they understand that you're not being cold to them, and they won't feel left in the dark about where they stand with you. Another tip I'll mention about vulnerability is that you have to make sure that you choose the right time, place, and context to be vulnerable. Have you ever had an experience where you're in a loud social setting, maybe at a bar or a restaurant, and somebody says something extremely personal, and suddenly the casual conversation comes to a screeching halt and everyone's left feeling very uncomfortable? That person didn't choose the right time or place to show vulnerability. Usually, you want to be vulnerable in a quieter setting, more one-on-one or in a small group, where other people are also sharing their stories. One way to know if it's an acceptable time to share your story with another person is to ask, "May I share something personal with you?" Or, "I have a story related to that. Do you want to hear it?" Brené Brown says that when you shut down vulnerability, you shut down opportunity, the opportunity to connect with others in a deep and meaningful way. And there is great courage in being vulnerable. It's the first thing we look for in others, but the last thing we're willing to share with them. Keep this perspective in mind. May it give you the courage to be vulnerable and build robust relationships. The next characteristic that we're going to talk about is grit, and I'm defining grit here as the willingness to get your hands dirty. I realize that this isn't the exact definition of grit, but just go with me on this one. Grit is about getting in the trenches with your employees. Don't ask them to do a task that you're not willing to do yourself. Know what you're asking of your team. If you don't know what a task entails, ask your employee to explain it to you or show you the procedure. Show an effort to learn what your employees' day-to-day responsibilities look like. While it's not always possible, demonstrating that you know how to do the tasks you're asking them to complete will grant you so much credibility with your team. This is one advantage that leaders who come up through the ranks have. They have credibility because many, if not all of their team members, have seen them do the tasks that they're asking them to do. Their employees realize, hey, she was in our shoes and she gets it. I was fortunate to start at the reception desk here at Hausmann Johnson because now when I'm training my employees, I can speak to them from experience. I can also jump in and cover the front desk if my team is shorthanded or needs support, and this builds credibility. If you weren't promoted to a leadership position to manage employees who are now in your previous role, there are other ways to get into the trenches and build credibility with your team. One way that I've seen work really well is through community service. The United Way's Days of Caring have consistently provided opportunities for our executives to volunteer side by side with all levels of employees. Our Vice President of Sales dug a garden next to our front desk administrator. I laid wood chips and cut down branches with our Chief Financial Officer to create a dog path for the Dane County Humane Society. Several of our agency's shareholders dug out a particularly stubborn stump with our marketing coordinator and a team of client advisors. Our agency's annual charitable tailgate event has also been a great way to get execs, consultants, and support staff working together to achieve a common goal. And an additional advantage to this is that the employees who coordinate this charity event are not executives or even supervisors. So the executive leaders have to look to the tailgate coordinators for guidance and leadership to make this event a success. So I'm not saying that you have to literally dig trenches with your employees to exhibit grit. What I'm saying is that a great leader pitches in to help out in whatever way is needed. A great leader never says or thinks, I'm too smart to do that, or I've been with my company for too many years to do such a menial task, or I have my MBA, why should I pick up that trash? That kind of thinking is elitist. And if you want to be a leader that inspires greatness in your employees, There's no room for elitism. I am fortunate in that I see examples of great leaders showing grit at work all the time. Our chairman of the board walks around our grounds and picks up garbage and sprays the weeds. I've walked into the office early in the morning and after hours to find our VP of Operations vacuuming. Our Vice President of Finance and various shareholders have answered phones at the front desk when the need arose. This kind of greediness, this willingness to get your hands dirty, builds so much goodwill amongst the employees and lower-level managers. It makes it feel like we're all in this together, like the execs have our back, and in turn, we'll all do whatever it takes to get the job done, whatever that job may be. In his book, Leaders Eat Last, Sinek draws a parallel between the United States Marine Corps' mess hall and how a leader should serve their team. The enlisted Marines go through the mess line first, and as the title says, leaders eat last. What that translates to is great leaders take the difficult situations and problems upon their shoulders, relieving their employees of the burden of the heavy lifting. Now, one way that I've found to do this for my own team is by being one of the people my team can call on if there's ever a difficult situation at the front desk. So, for example, we're located on a pedestrian and bike path, and in the summer, we sometimes get homeless people loitering for a good amount of time in our building. When this has happened and my team has already tried to direct them out of the building, they know that they can call me and I will take over the burden of the situation so they can go back to doing their job. A great leader puts him or herself in the line of fire before they put their employee in the line of fire. Leaders should always stand up for their employees, believe them and believe in them, give them the benefit of the doubt, and build them up in private and in public. The final characteristic of a great leader that I want to talk about is flexibility. The best leaders are comfortable changing things up when they're not working as well as they could be. It's great if we know what our goals are, but it's even better when we're okay with altering the course when necessary to reach those goals. And the best way to figure out how to alter that course is to solicit ideas from your team. Because they're the ones doing the work, they're often our best resources for creativity when it comes to solving a problem. An inspired leader is open to their associates' ideas and is flexible enough to allow the best of those ideas to be implemented. Brené Brown reminds us that leaders aren't supposed to have all the answers. We're just supposed to know how to solicit ideas and how to put those ideas into action. Let me share a story with you that speaks to this from the charity tailgate event I mentioned previously. A newer employee from my team came to me with an idea to host a silent online auction before the day of the tailgate to raise more money for our charity, which is the American Family Children's Hospital here in Madison. A good idea for a worthy cause, right? Well, I'm a bit embarrassed to admit that my initial reaction was inflexibility. All I could think of was, think of all the extra work this is going to create. It's a logistical nightmare. Luckily, my employee is resilient. She stood her ground and patiently explained how it would work and that it would add a great deal of value to our event. And it's a good thing that she did because her auction in its first year raised over $6,500. Without her persistence, my own inflexibility would have created a missed opportunity to do even more good in our community. So who knows what can happen when you open yourself up to new ideas. And finally, know what your employees' strengths are and be willing to adjust job duties to match those strengths. You'll find your employees are happier in their work, more productive, and more likely to go the extra mile if they are doing what they do best. That's not to say that cross-training doesn't happen so that everyone on the team knows how to do all the tasks, or that they only have to do the tasks that they enjoy. Just that in their day-to-day work, allowing some flexibility with job duties can make everyone's jobs go more smoothly. On our team, we review job duties annually so that we ensure that all team members are doing what they do best with at least a few tasks that challenge them or bring them joy or personal fulfillment. Lou Holt said it best when he said, "Life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond to it." Great leaders respond to adversity with a willingness to be flexible in their approach. So now what? Okay, so you know that honesty, vulnerability, grit, and flexibility are what it takes to be an inspired leader. So what do you do about it? First and foremost, get yourself a mentor if you don't already have one. This isn't necessarily the person that you report to or even necessarily anyone that you work with. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just one person either. It needs to be someone or multiple someones that you look up to as a role model for their leadership skills. You might have to get creative when you're looking for your mentor. Maybe you're lucky and it is the person who supervises you, but maybe it's an elder in your church. Maybe it's a fellow PTA parent. Maybe it's the guy who coordinated your neighborhood's intramural basketball team. Whoever it is, identify them for yourself, and then your next step is to tell them you admire their leadership skills and would like the opportunity to bounce ideas off of them from time to time. We often think that finding a mentor is the job of the mentor, but really, it's the responsibility of the mentee. If you want to get mentored, you have to do the work. You got to make the phone call, set up the meeting, take your mentor out to coffee, do whatever they need to get them to set some time aside so that you can learn from their experiences. My next suggestion is to practice centering yourself. If you remember, centering yourself involves taking a few calming breaths to give yourself time to remove your personal emotions from a situation in order to address it from a more logical, compassionate point of view. If you practice centering when the stakes are low, you'll be ready when the you-know-what hits the fan. The best way to improve is to practice in the midst of everyday occurrences, whether that's waiting in line at the post office, getting cut off in traffic, or having to change your plans last minute because of a scheduling conflict. When I practice centering in these moments, I take a few slow, calming breaths and try to look at the situation differently without all of the negative emotion. Maybe that guy who just cut me off is rushing to meet his pregnant wife at the hospital. How awesome is it that that old lady writing a check in the express lane at the grocery store is still independent enough to shop for herself? I bet her grandkids are super proud of her. Even though you can and will feel corny for making yourself look at the bright side, thinking this way really does work to diffuse that negativity, allowing you to focus more clearly on what really matters. If centering works waiting in line at the grocery store, just imagine what it can do in a difficult performance review. And finally, I just want to say how even the smallest changes can yield huge results. If you only take one suggestion from one of the 4 characteristics, your employees will notice a difference, and it will change their attitude in how they show up for work. And your own supervisor will notice a difference, and that might inspire them to improve their own leadership skills. The culture of your company depends entirely on how your company's leaders show up every day, how they interact with their team members and with each other. And you don't have to be perfect to be great. You may or may not be aware that Hausmann Johnson has made Fortune magazine's list of best workplaces for the past several years. And it's not because we're perfect and never make any mistakes. It's because our executives and leaders are fiercely dedicated to being honest, vulnerable, gritty, and flexible, most especially when we've made a mistake. There is no simple formula that you can plug in and magically become a great place to work. It is self-awareness and commitment to the characteristics of leadership we discussed today. I want to leave you with some food for thought from Vince Molinaro, who wrote, "No matter how challenging a situation or conflict is, you have the obligation to be the leader. That's the higher standard you are being held to. Don't lead as you are led, but lead as you know you must. I want to thank you all so much for listening and learning with me today. I hope you leave feeling a little bit more inspired as you head into the rest of your day. You got this. I have included my contact information here because I want you to feel comfortable reaching out to me with any questions, comments, or thoughts you may have as you digest the information from my presentation. I also included 5 of the leadership books that I used to create the content of this webinar, and I did reference a few of them throughout my presentation. I highly recommend that every leader read these books multiple times throughout their lives, regardless of how long you've been a leader, how many people are on your team, or the nature of your business. There is a great deal of value in continuous learning and always striving to improve. And with that, I think we can see if we have any questions or comments that have come through.
That's right. Now, if you have a question, please put it into our chat or questions feature. I see we already have a couple, so we are going to start doing a question and answer session now. So the first question we have is, I have an employee who has a bad attitude. It is affecting my team, and I'm not sure what to do. What are some suggestions for addressing this?
Ooh, that's tough. I am so sorry that you have to deal with that. It is so hard to keep morale up when you have what we're going to call a bad egg. I can tell you that I have had similar experiences on my own team and with varying outcomes. The first time that I can think of was an issue with an employee on my administrative team who believed that administrative work was beneath them. They joined our team as a way to get their foot in the door to our agency with a vision to transfer to another department. I was able to handle that by dangling the carrot. If you want to move into that department, you have to show that you are a team player and are eager to fulfill your job requirements. So if that's something that you see in your employee with the bad attitude, you know, that they might be a better fit in another department, you could try the carrot tactic. You know, another time that I can think of, I had an employee who just wreaked havoc with one of the other employees on my team. They used bullying and manipulative tactics and really just made my other employee absolutely miserable. That one was tougher. So if it's like that, you know, it requires a lot of behavioral write-ups, meetings with HR, and a lot of diligent note-taking. And that's what we ended up doing, and we had to finally terminate their employment with our company because those behavioral issues never improved. And then the last time that I dealt with this, I saw that my employee with the bad attitude was just extremely unhappy. I laid out the realities of the job and my expectations of them, and then asked, is this what you want to do? Are you happy here? And at first they said, yes, I am happy here. But then I pointed out a few behaviors that I had observed, like the nasty comments, picking fights with coworkers, just negative behavior, you know, negative language, and that behavior made me think that maybe they weren't happy. And I think that once they realized that those behaviors were noticeable, they admitted that no, they're not happy. I gave this employee the weekend to think about my expectations and the reality of the job, and asked them to come back on Monday and let me know if they were on board or if they were ready to resign. And they chose to resign. Listen, like, every workplace isn't the right fit for everybody. We might be a great place to work, but we're not a great place for everyone. Not everyone will thrive in every culture. Ideally, you can suss that out in the interview process, but that's just not always possible. Things change, attitudes change, job duties change, the realities of the job sink in after a time. And your job as a leader is to coach that person to be the best version of themselves. And if that means coaching them out of the organization, then that's what you're going to have to do. Best of luck to you on that one.
We have another question. Finding a mentor has been challenging for me. Do you have specific insights or resources for this?
Yeah, thank you really for that question. I actually do have a suggestion because, you know, you might be in a small organization or you might have leadership that you don't look up to. I would recommend, you know, if you can't find them in the community, then seek them out through like TED Talks, through some of the authors that I mentioned on this screen here. I mean, I can't really discuss that with them, but I would say that their resources have been really inspiring to me. And so I would say, you know, Simon Sinek for sure. He's the author of Leaders Eat Last, but he also did a TED Talk. He's done a few TED Talks, but the one that comes to mind is How Great Leaders Inspire Action. Brene Brown's TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability. She's also the author up there of Daring Greatly and Dare to Lead. And then I would also say that the team of authors who created the book Crucial Conversations have a group called Crucial Skills by Vital Smarts. And if you just Google search Crucial Skills by Vital Smarts, it will come up. And I subscribe to their newsletter. It comes once a week on Wednesday mornings. And I don't always have time to go through them right away. I have to admit right now I have a backlog of about 4. But I do use them. You know, you're getting blog posts directly from the authors of, you know, of Crucial Conversations, and they have really powerful insights. You know, it's usually somebody will write in a question and they will respond, and they'll give you real examples of how to deal with, you know, issues that I'm sure that you've been dealing with in your own leadership struggles. I will say that, you know, before I read Crucial Conversations, I heard from about 50 people that I should read Crucial Conversations, and I'm somebody who's skeptical of hype, but seriously, read Crucial Conversations. It lives up to the hype, and it has affected my professional relationships, but maybe even my personal relationships more. So I highly, highly recommend that one. Of all the 5, I would say that one is probably the most important. I hope that helps you.
All right, we have another question. I have an employee who I have had a conversation about their personal cell phone usage at work. It keeps happening even though this employee tries to hide it. What should I do next?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I hear you, I see you. That is just so frustrating, right? Okay, so if I was in that position, I think that what I would do is I would point out, I would go to this person and I would have a written document in my hand, and I would say, on this date, we talked about your personal cell phone usage. On this date, we talked about your personal cell phone usage. I would put the date, okay? Like if you can have the date, or even the month, like if you can say, okay, back in July, we talked about this. Okay, but we also talked about it in September, and now it's November, and I'm still having this conversation with you. I'm starting to wonder, is there something going on in your personal life that you would like to share with me or with HR? Because it's starting to feel like maybe you need to be on your cell phone for, you know, because there's some kind of personal emergency. Give them the benefit of the doubt, even if you know that they're just on Facebook. Like, give them an out. I kind of gave that example a little bit when I was talking about that conversation, that difficult feedback conversation I had to have. I gave my employee the benefit of the doubt. And there are studies that show, and it's sort of loosely related, but just go with me. Back when I was a child care teacher, we were told about a study that explained that young single mothers, like teenage mothers, when people would give them feedback saying, "You are such a wonderful mother. I can see how much your baby loves you, how much your baby, wants to be around you." Even if they weren't actually seeing that behavior, that conversation actually made those mothers behave in a more nurturing, kind, loving way. I have seen this work, not with single moms who are teenagers, but in my own experience with my employees. So saying, I know that you are a smart employee and that you understand that this personal cell phone usage issue is a problem for me, and yet I'm still seeing you do this. So now I'm wondering, is there something else going on that you would like to share with me? And then if there is, okay, now we take that to HR and we say, okay, well, maybe there is a special dispensation that needs to be made for this person because they have a child with special needs at school. I don't know, who knows? If there isn't something personal going on and they're just misbehaving, now you put a behavioral plan into action. You say, okay, we've talked about it once, we've talked about it twice. This is the third time I'm going to tell it to you. We're going to write up this document, and it's going to say, we've talked about it. It cannot happen again. If it happens again, we're going to take the steps necessary. And I would suggest bringing in your HR into this conversation, okay? Because they have templates, and if you don't have HR, I would encourage you to reach out to our human resources team here at Hausmann Johnson, because they do consulting for our clients, so just be aware of that. But they have templates that can make it a lot, you're not recreating the wheel here, so you don't have to just know how to do all this stuff. And you can say, not just say, but in a document, we've talked about this once, we've talked about it twice, this is the third time. It cannot happen again. I sign it, you sign it. So then, if and when it happens again, you have the document in your hand. You say, listen, we talked about this. You're not hiding it. I can see you. I'm a human with eyes. I can see it happening, and it's unacceptable. It seems like a silly thing maybe to fire somebody over, but there's a larger issue here, right? They're not taking you seriously as a leader. And make sure that you're not getting caught doing the same thing, okay? Because people do follow by example. And I'm not saying that you are, but I'm just saying, you can't tell people to do something that you yourself are not doing, just throwing that out there. So also, very good luck to you. I'm sure you're going to do an awesome job with this one. Anything else?
All right, looks like we've got a couple more questions. Someone wrote, do you believe team building exercises are effective?
That is a really good question. And I do think that they have the potential to be effective. But again, I think that it's only effective if the leader is vulnerable and buys into its efficacy. I can tell you that I have seen team building. You know what? We just did a team building exercise on Monday with our agency, and if a leader is rolling their eyes, then the team is going to see that and think that it's a waste of their time or that it's silly. So the only way to have a team exercise that actually works is you just have to let yourself go and buy into the idea that it is going to work and that it's not silly, and be willing to be silly. Be willing to, if it's a silly thing, just let go. Be a human. Be the human that you would want to see your own leaders be. So yes, I do believe that they can be effective if you buy into it as the leader.
All right, we're coming up on our time here, so I am going to change the slide to the credits for those of you who need continuing education credits. And we just want to thank you so much for attending today's webinar. As a reminder, we would love for you to fill out the very short survey sent to you for your feedback, and it is very important to us. We appreciate all of the feedback that we receive. Our 2019 webinar schedule is going to be announced shortly, and we will keep you up to date on our exciting new webinar topics for the next year. If you have been part of a webinar series from the start of this year, we especially want to thank you for joining us, and we hope that you have found it to be a rewarding experience. You can sign up for our upcoming webinars on the Hausmann Johnson website, and again, we would like to thank you for attending, and have a great rest of your day.